Yeah, I'll try and do that then. I may skip over, talk very little about some slides then. Let's see, I don't know where I can get a pointer. Arnaz, are you going to record? Raja, are you recording? You're on mute, Raja.
Yeah, I'll ask Srinivas to record.
I don't know
Srinivas,
if you are. I just don't know. Then I'll actually change it, change what I'm saying in that way.
yeah,
If
so
I,
we'll be recording this, yeah. Srinivas, can you hear us? We would like you to record this session.
Yes, he's started it. I just spoke to him. He's just started the recording.
Okay.
okay. Arnaz, can you see the pointer?
No. Yeah, yes, I can. Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Because I'm trying to, that's important. I don't know how I can get a laser. Let's see. You're seeing all the slides now or only one slide? Same thing.
No, all the slides now.
Okay. Now one slide.
Now, yes, now one. Yes.
Okay. Let's try this.
You can't come and take whatever you. Dr. Rata, you had a problem getting on?
No, I did not have any problem as such. Can't hear you.
I'm not sure whether they are, if people they have to let people into the call or what. I'll just check once with them.
Yeah, sure. We'll start in about 2 minutes.
Sure, sure.
Sure.
Just heard that many parts of UK and France are going into lockdown.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the second surge starting.
Yeah.
I'll show you the last graph. This is clear.
So Arna, shall we start now?
Sure.
We can start
Okay.
now so that we get enough time for Dr. Mehta also to finish his talk.
Okay, sure. Okay, let's go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the science and the therapeutics of COVID-19 by Dr. Mehul Mehta. The webinar is being co-hosted by IHOPE, which is an acronym for Indian Health Outcomes, Public Health and Economics Research Center, and EHAC, which is the Equitable Healthcare Access Consortium. IHOPE is an exciting collaborative and interdisciplinary research center that is being set up with a 10 crore competitive research grant from the Wellcome Trust, DBT India Alliance, through collaborations between the LV Prasad Eye Institute, the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and the Indian Institute of Public Health, Hyderabad. The key focus of the center will be big data analysis, health economics, clinical and public health research in eye health. The Equitable Healthcare Access is a consortium comprising of socially sensitive healthcare providers, organizations that are involved in fostering livelihood, and educational institutes from across the country. These organizations have come together out of the concern for dwindling ethics and growing inequities in access to healthcare in India. I would now like to introduce Dr. Raja Narayanan, who will be the moderator for this webinar. He is the principal investigator for the iHope project. He is also the director and network head of clinical research at LV Prasad Eye Institute. Dr. Raja, over to you.
Thank you so much, Arnaz, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mehul Mehta, the speaker today for the webinar. He has a very long CV, but I will keep it brief. There are many accomplishments to his name. He is the Chief Medical Officer at Albright Stonebridge Group and also faculty at the Department of Ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School. He was born in Mumbai though. He's Indian at heart. He did his clinical fellowship at the Mass Eye and Ear in Boston and also did his research fellowship at the Scapens Research Institute. He is a senior fellow at the Harvard Global Health Initiative, and he's also the vice president of Partners Healthcare International. Among his current roles, he's also working on the WHO working group on artificial intelligence in healthcare. He does a lot of amazing work, although he is a friend of ours as an ophthalmologist, but today you will be listening to him talking about COVID, the science and therapeutics, and he will not sound like an ophthalmologist. So it's amazing to hear him, and also we would like to know from him how he learned so much about non-ophthalmology and how does he keep up to date. And he can in fact teach us about COVID. Over to you, Mehul, for your talk.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Arnaz. Really, that's a very kind introduction. And I thank iHope, the Equitable Health Access Consortium, and LV Prasad for inviting me. It's really an honor. I've been really honored to work with LV Prasad over these years and work with such an amazing institute. So what I'm going to do over the next 35 to 40 minutes is give you really the science of COVID. What I'm not going to do is talk about transmission, talk about testing. But at the end of this, I hope you'll better understand what we are dealing with and where do therapeutics rest. I'm not going to touch upon the public health side of it. So without much further ado, I'm going to really get into the virus itself. And since this is going to be primarily a physician audience or a healthcare audience, I'm not going to explain a lot of the scientific terms. But what we are dealing with is the seventh of a encapsulated spherical or oval novel virus, because it has mutated from its previous predecessors, which is the SARS virus. And what we face now is a highly contagious virus that is virulent in its impact, with a greater degree of mortality than flu. The important things to really look at here are the viral structure, because that is what has become the target or the Achilles' heel that we are trying to go and tackle. So spherical virus encapsulated with a membrane, lipid membrane, has these surface spike glycoproteins, which fundamentally give it its ability to infect. So its virulence is based on the spike glycoproteins. I'll talk a bit about that. Nucleocapsid really encompasses a long RNA. It's one of the longest RNAs of any RNA virus. And the RNA itself completely encodes for viral replication. The key thing to remember is that the envelope, the spike glycoprotein, the nucleocapsid, and the RNA are all in aggregate target therapeutic sites for us to treat this. And also knowing this helps us understand how it infects. So let's really talk a bit about the spike, because that's the one that we are concerned about the most. This is an actual reproduction of the spike. Simply put, it is three glycoproteins intertwined with each other. The sugar molecules give it its sort of stealth mode, and that's how it's not picked up by the immune system that quickly. And once it has to attach to the cell receptor, which I'll talk about in a moment, these spikes at its apex have to unfurl and expose what's called the receptor binding domain, the RBD. And to do that, it requires to really recruit a serine protease, which is present on our cells, that allows this proteolysis, if you will, and then membrane fusion to occur. So this opening of the spike is one of the key things, and this is again becomes a key area for us to target, especially with vaccines, because a lot of vaccines are going at the receptor binding domain. Interestingly enough, the apex has been where the mutations occur. The stem is common among many coronaviruses. So this is an important thing to keep in mind, that we are really dealing with the spike, and the spike becomes a key player throughout the infective process. So now let's talk a bit about the replication. This is a simple schematic that talks about the replication, but I just want to walk you through. The entry site is ACE2, angiotensin converting enzyme 2. A lot of you will remember it's part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And ACE2 is ubiquitously present across many organ systems, like the GI system, the cardiovascular system, obviously the respiratory system, in the male testes. And all these become target sites for where the virus attacks. So when you think of the systemic organ system involvement, it's all where ACE2 is abundantly expressed. The virus attaches to ACE2 but cannot enter unless it recruits TMPRSS2, which is really a serine protease that's present on the cells. It takes it, the spike undergoes proteolysis, the stump of the spike fuses, and then it enters through the normal endocytic process of a cell. This endocytic process obviously opens up because lysozymes attach, and then the entire viral DNA, complete blueprint for viral replication, takes over the ribosomes, takes over the Golgi apparatus. Viral proteins are created out of our own cells, and the whole replication complex comes out. Virus is re-encapsulated, new lipid membranes form, and exocytosis takes it out. Important to remember here is the fact that more RNA is produced than number of viruses. The conversion rate is 1 to 100 to 1,000. That means single virus entry, 1,000 viruses coming out, but many more RNA pieces. Why do I highlight this? It's this RNA that we pick up in RT-PCR. So sometimes you can get an RT-PCR positive with no viral load simply because you picked up the excess RNA that's still floating around. Important to remember. Okay, virus comes out. So this is sort of what happens. And because ACE2 is expressed widely in the lungs, heart, GI system, salivary glands, cardiovascular system, testes, you will see these organs playing up, which I'll show you in a second. So I just want to leave you with this as the basis of how we are going to look at what's happening to organ systems and what's happening to therapy, okay? So one thing to remember is the virus has mutated. What we saw initially in the early months was a different virus. And basically the mutations occurred, there are 3-point mutations occurred in amino acid 614 sequences, where you had aspartic acid converted to glycine, and that's really given it its increased virulence. So you can see here in this global data sharing database for viral genomics is that there is a change in the virus. And in India, in fact, this is the dominant lineage we are seeing. There are 320 lineage, the 3 types of lineages in India, the 20 ABC, and certain parts of India have 20A, and certain parts have 20B, and certain parts have 20C, all carrying the D614G mutation, okay? So we are dealing with a virus that's spreading really fast, and the mutation occurred because one of the 3 glycoprotein chains was not cleaving efficiently, and the virus self-mutated to make that cleavage much faster. So that's what you remember about the virus, that really it's the spike attacking through ACE and replicating very fast and infecting other cells. Obviously, entry points are obvious to us. If as physicians, it's nose, it's conjunctiva, it's respiratory system, it's mouth. These are the real entry points. Since it also goes through the GI system, the virus is excreted in the feces, and that's still an area that we have not really figured out, is any fecal-oral transmission occurring or not. But you can see it widely in the feces, and I'll actually talk about this in a second. So as I mentioned, I'm jumping through everything about transmission and testing and all, because you all are doing it, you know it, and it's not something I want to repeat. But I want to give you a different insight into the disease pathology. So let's look at the ACE expression. All these places have ACE expression, and you will see that the virus is actually going to attack all. Obviously, it's a respiratory virus. It's part of the respiratory viral group, if you will. It causes acute respiratory distress, but it's a very different type of acute respiratory distress in that patients are hypoxic, but they don't have the hypoxia-related distress that you see, and therefore, in lay terms, they're called happy hypoxics. The lungs turn out to be hyperpliable. We have a better understanding why. So this is what's happening in the respiratory system, and then it goes through the same ARDS type of presentation. Cardiology, actually, we are finding 20% of patients have sudden onset MI, cardiac arrest, for many causes. And the key causes that are driving it are A, viral infection of myocardial, B, toxic myocarditis because of the cytokine storm, which I'll talk about in a moment. The third is obviously we are in a hypoxic state, and systemic demands are serious when you have the infection, and myocardium faces what's called a type 2 myocardial infarction, which is really a demand supply mismatch. It's not a vascular flow phenomena. It's really a physiological demand supply mismatch because of the hypoxia in the presence of a diffuse viremia, and that's what's causing the heart attacks. And finally, there are clots because of the whole pathology of increased coagulation that occurs with the virus. And plaques that are present in the coronary arteries get inflamed because of the endothelial inflammation, which I'll talk about in a second. So 5 different pathways that are now identified for cardiac involvement and cardiac arrest. I'll talk a little bit more about the lungs and the heart because they have manifestations that are more long-term. You're seeing neurological phenomena. Anosmia and hypogeusia, we know, are very pathognomic of the disease, but we are seeing necrotizing encephalitis, probably toxic necrotizing encephalitis. There is psychosis, there's demyelination. Whether direct viral infection of these parts of the brain or whether it is due to the toxic syndrome, that's still worked out, but these are phenomena that are seen more and more. We don't talk much about the kidneys, but kidneys are seriously impacted. And if you see what's happening in the intensive care units, we have an acute shortage of dialysis machines. This is more tubular than glomerular, and there is a lot of tubular necrosis going on in these kidneys. So long-term, do we deal with chronic renal failure? That's the question. Interesting findings in the blood, in the vascular system, endothelial cell infiltration. I'll show you endothelial inclusion bodies. Along with that, microemboli, and then these go across and cause occlusion of multiple organ systems, multiple vessels. And then this whole phenomenon, cytokine storm, which is important to understand. And across the GI system, because it affects pancreatitis, has been a first presentation in a small subset of cases. What I've not shown here is what happens in children. Fortunately, children do not get symptomatic. About 3 to 5% get symptomatic, and when they do, they actually go through a diffuse vasculitis. They go to, and it looks like a Kawasaki's disease. What's important to realize about children is they spread a lot. They shed a lot, and therefore children are a source of spreaders, which has come out with the recent paper from the Mass General Children's Center in the Journal of Pediatrics. Very good paper, you should look at it, of viral load from children. Immune reaction. I think the best way to think of it is in 3 buckets. You can have a hypoimmune reaction, or hyperimmune reaction, or immunoprotective reaction. And this is how the patient will present. So when there's immune suppression going on in a patient, you'll have a hypoimmune reaction. There's rapid spread of the COVID, obviously, and there's infective organ damage, and superinfections are very common. So you can have a bacterial superinfection in many of these cases, and they go to septicemia and septic shock. Most are immunoprotective, and now we find that around 40 to 50% are asymptomatic, and they fall into this bucket. And then you have this inflammatory surge and the cytokine shock, and Here is less of the viral spread, but more of the hyperimmune reaction, and end organ failure occurs because cytokine storm and the whole storm syndrome is really hard to manage. And that causes so much of toxic shock. So super infections do occur here, but then the whole system, and here you'd find that all the markers are high, right? So all your inflammatory markers are high, C-reactive protein is high. Because of the hypercoagulable state, D-dimer goes up, ferritin goes up because of release from RBCs, the RBC cell lysis going on. And IL-6, I'll talk about that in a second, interleukin-6, which is a key mediator of the whole cytokine storm system. So it depends where you stay along the spectrum, patients stay. And really it's a battle between the virus and the immune system here. You know, the entire, this I've just shown a natural killer cell here, and how it works. And this is the IgM, which is the first immunoglobulin to react to the virus and, you know, and try and agglutinate it. A bit about why is this virus creating cytokine storms? Simply put, this virus's attack is anomalous. And that is now attributed to, let me tell you the attack first. Normally a virus attacks, and what's going to happen is there's a release of interferon that's going to signal to the neighboring cells that there's an attack going on. There's gene upregulation that goes up then, and there's cells are more prepared. So cell to cell spread is much less in a normal, that's the body's defense mechanism in a normal common respiratory virus. But the other thing that also happens is that it does not accentuate cytokine release to the level that this virus does. This virus does the opposite. It suppresses interferon release. And so what happens is the next cell is not prepared for the viral attack, while it does not suppress cytokine release. So you get this cascading phenomena of cell-to-cell spread with increasing cytokine release, resulting in a cytokine storm. Why is this happening? Well, if they looked at the viral genome, and what they found is the open reading frameworks of the virus, if you look at the genomic sequences at 3B, are much more truncated than the normal virus. Just for you to remind you, it's, you know, when you look at nucleotide sequences with no stop codons, that's an open reading frame. And then the open reading frames in this case are much shorter. So that's probably what's happening. There's a terrific paper in Cell, which you should look at if you're interested. And by the way, I've tried to reference every one of my slides where the data sources or the figure sources are, and you should look at them if you're interested to know more about what's happening. So this is probably the theory going on. Apart from the whole ACE theory, which suggests that because ACE2 is infected, ACE2 is not acting. So as you remember, angiotensin 2 builds up. And as angiotensin 2 builds up, ACE2 cannot convert angiotensin 2 to angiotensin 1,7. So all the hypercoagulable states and all the inflammatory states that angiotensin 2 creates just build up. So one thing adds to the other. So we are probably going to find multiple pathways for cytokine storm. I want you to understand this because this is really a key management issue when we treat patients who are sick, who are admitted, because it's really the balance between the immunity and cytokine storm. I want to touch upon the two things. This is very new work that's come out. These are actually lung electron microscopic pictures, upper left, which I'm showing you here with my pointer. If you look, microthrombi in the vessels in the lungs, in the alveolar vessels, and also RBC extravasation. Panel A is actually a normal alveolus. Panel B is a destroyed alveolus. And why is this destruction occurring? Very interestingly, if you look at the vessels, there's intussusceptive neovascularization occurring. And if you remember, intussusceptive is when a single vessel, when a vessel split because of hypoxic or neovascular stimuli, they create within the vessels intussusceptive neovascularization. And these abnormal blood vessels, which in ophthalmology we see so much in ARMD, we see it in diabetic retinopathy and all the vasculitis, seems to be playing out here in the lung now. And this is causing destruction. And this is an EM of the vessel. If you see RC is red blood cell, and then if you see within the endothelium, there's all these viral inclusion bodies, and you look at the endothelial swelling here. This is what's causing the microthrombi, okay? So this is a very telling paper. It's Ackerman's paper in New England Journal of Medicine, a pathology of lung tissue, and really is a paper that's got a lot of very interesting thought process. Is there pericytic loss going on, like we see in diabetic eye disease? Seems to be that's what's happening also. So we are dealing with neovascularization of the aberrant kind here, which I find interesting because, you know, it opens up this whole question of now do VEGFs work and not work and all that in treating. Cardiac also showing changes. And what this very interesting paper that came out, which we are seeing much more of, is the recovered patients, 78% had cardiovascular involvement. Here is lymphocytic involvement of the lungs, of the heart, myocardium. If you see here, this is a T1, T2 acquisition of gadolinium, and you see it's in the myocardium, you're getting a really strong signal. And here is pericardial effusion with myocardial involvement. What is really concerning is that this was irrespective of pre-existing conditions, severity of the disease, time to diagnosis. This is only a 100-case study cohort, but this has been replicated. And recently, in the US, among young athletes, they found 20% had long-term or medium-term cardiac issues. So the question is, are we going to see what I'm calling a post-COVID syndrome, right? And very interestingly, Boston University just opened its post-COVID clinic because they're finding patients who are not fully recovered and who are having ongoing issues. And it seems to be really around the lungs and the heart. The kidneys, if they're very sick and they come back, they're on dialysis and come back, they're on chronic renal failure. So we are seeing it's not just this viral infection and it's over. And I think this is important to understand from a clinical standpoint, that we may be seeing ongoing pathology in multiple organ systems, especially the lung and the heart. Enough said. I'm not going to talk of public health measures, but I'm really going to get straight into therapy. So this is a great paper in Nature Nanotechnology, which you should look at. And this schematic I loved because it just shows you how understanding the viral attack tells you where therapeutic targets are. So basically, the virus comes in and all the monoclonals, all the vaccines, convalescent plasma is all trying to prevent its attachment to ACE. That's what it's doing, right? It attacks the spike. Because ACE requires the surface protease, TMPRSS2, you have drugs that block it, right? Camostat mycilate is one of those drugs. Endocytosis and then the release from endocytic vesicle was what chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine is supposed to block because it changes the pH of the lysozyme. Didn't, at least in clinical cases, didn't show very strong sort of theoretical hope that it would, but it didn't. And then there are drugs that act in this whole process of release of virus genome, as I mentioned, recruiting the ribosomes, polypeptide to proteolysis to recreating the whole viral RNA. So these two drugs, which are anti-HIV drugs, were thought to act here, didn't act. Remdesivir does act here. By the way, remdesivir is a nucleotide, adenosine nucleotide analog. It's a prodrug. And what it does with RNA polymerase, it really blocks the polymerase reaction because you have this nucleotide analog, the adenosine one that goes in here, and basically you don't get full RNA, right? Now, virus has to recoat itself. So progesterone, interestingly, blocks one is the sigma-1 receptor that is important for recoating itself. Fluoxetine, which is really an antipsychotic, is a psychiatric drug, seems to act here, exocytosis. Now, while all this is happening, obviously the cell knows it's being infected and it stimulates cytokines and it goes through the Janus kinase 1 and 2 pathway. Very interesting work in blocking Janus kinase 1 and 2 and the JAK-STAT pathway here. And then cytokine activation, and we know dexamethasone has shown to act. Tocilizumab, mixed results, and I'll show you in a moment. It's an IL-6 blocker, and the whole cytokine storm, management. So this is why targeting is really important to understand what is the drug doing at each stage. And I'm just going to give you a summary that only two drugs that have shown proved effect by multi-centric randomized clinical trials is remdesivir and dex. The recovery trial for dex showed 1/3 mortality reduction and 1/5 reduction in non-ventilated oxygen cases in preventing ventilation or mechanical ventilation or intubation. What's interesting is a methylprednisolone study, also multicentric in Brazil, did not show. So it's really, we are not getting strong repeatable evidence. It's still dex is the right thing to do, but I'm just want to show you that the studies when replicated with another steroid did not show the same effect. Remdesivir has two effects: reduces hospital stay, but not viral load and not mortality. And the second thing about remdesivir is that in moderate cases, recent data showed, which they published, non-hypoxic, the clinical scores improved. Okay, hydroxychloroquine unproved. Tocilizumab and sarilumab are two targeted IL-6 monoclonals. Phase 3 did not reach end trials, and basically it's a mixed bag. I know Toci is still being given, but Toci does cause superinfections because it blocks the whole ability of cytokines to block another bacterial infection or viral infection, and that's a challenge. I think I want to talk about the JAK1 and 2 inhibitors, which are very interesting, and interferons, because it's really an interferon reduction that's causing the lack of cells to really be ready for the attack. So question that's being looked at is, are interferons given early the right approach? JAK1 and JAK2 inhibitors, there's a great meta-analysis and the data looks really interesting. So let's see how these studies progress, but it'll be interesting to look at whether JAK-STAT is a target area of helping. This, by the way, you know how corticosteroids act. This is a great schematic. You know, all inflammatory markers go down, and then inflammation is reduced. And this really helps in the overall. That's why I think DEX showed the effect it did. So we've been using DEX a lot in ophthalmology, and we know its effect. And it's not surprising that one would see a DEX effect here. Favipiravir, by the way, is another prodrug which was H1N1, just like remdesivir. It's a product that is that's a nucleoside analog, and its phase 3 has started. Let's see where it comes out. But a lot of these are in trials, and at this stage, nothing has come out that shows concrete evidence of effect. So we are still waiting for the antiviral that's going to have an effect. Let's look at monoclonals, because there's a big push for monoclonals, and they could actually provide a huge therapeutic platform for patients who are sick to prevent them from getting sicker. The Lilly results are really good. They haven't published it, but they just announced it, that corporate announcement. Small cohort, but really strong results. And this is a monoclonal that they took from the Ebola site, and I believe, and then have used it against COVID. And what they found is that the endpoint viral load did change from baseline. Rate of hospitalizations dropped compared to the placebo and was really well tolerated. So there's a lot of monoclonal work going on. And Regeneron, which did really interesting work in Ebola, is looking at a polyclonal, a cocktail. Now, where are the monoclonals targeting? It's the spike. It's all the spike. The question is, are they going for the receptor binding domain, or are they going for the full spike? And that's what really vaccines are all about. So I hope monoclonals will come out much faster. And with that, we will actually have something in our arsenal that can cut the mortality. Once we can keep patients out of the intensive care or out of ventilation, I think we've achieved a lot in bending this curve. Okay. Till then, we are still doing the public health measures, because that's the only way we know how to prevent it. So look out for monoclonals and look out for the Lilly results. They said they're going to publish it soon, but I'm very curious to see what the actual data looks like. Vaccines, which everybody's been talking about. So let me give you what I think is an honest appraisal of vaccines. Great paper, Nature Nanotechnology on vaccine structures. Everybody, as I said, is going for the spike, right? And important to realize that there are two parts in the spike to go for. One is the receptor binding domain and one is the full spike. How do you go for the spike? The old ways were go with inactivated or live attenuated vaccines, right? And this is still being done, and I'll show you some groups that are doing this and that are actually already approved for limited use. Vectored vaccines are using an adenovirus to deliver the nucleotide sequences, so that the adenovirus infects the human cell, and then production for the nucleotide sequences then cause the production of just the spike or the receptor binding domain, and the immune system picks this up, and then the immune system is primed to fight the virus when it sees the spike and sees the pattern. It's really a pattern recognition, what's going on. But we are using the body's own, in a vectored vaccine, if you realize it, body's own system to produce these epitopes, all the epitopes that we want the immune system to go after. So one way to deliver this is through a vector vaccine. vector, which is the adenovirus platform, which is the main one they're using, or to use RNA. This is messenger RNA. So it's not even vectored, but it's put through nanoparticles and lipid nanoparticles. The messenger RNA goes, it carries the sequence for the spike, and then the cells produce, human cells, the immunized patient cell produces the spike, immune system picks it up. That's the basic thesis on which this works, okay? There's some recombinant work going on where the entire spike is created outside and plastered onto some carrier molecule and the body sees it, and that some companies are doing it like Novavax, they're creating this sort of recombinant spike outside. Any platform you use has to go through production. And this is where it becomes complicated. Production is not easy to scale at this stage, right? Production sequences are complex. Approval, getting batch to batch variability down, making sure you have enough medical grade glass, but more importantly, it's equitably distributed. This is a challenge, equitable distribution, and I'll talk a bit about it. So here is the summary. What we have today is 165 plus vaccines, of which 9 are in phase 3, and out of the 9, 5 have been given limited approval. So let's look at the 9. The AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, which India has talked a lot about, used the chimpanzee adenovirus. Why? Because they said that, listen, human adenovirus, people may have immunity against it. Now that's proving to be a big problem. There is immunity against it. And therefore you take chimpanzee one, and they had used this for malaria vaccine creation. So they're using the same platform. They used it for Ebola. This is in phase 3. CanSino Bio used the human adenovirus. You know, it's approved for limited use. J&J is using adenovirus 26 to get away from this whole issue of inherent adenovirus immunity, because it's a human adenovirus. So people have seen it before. 26, and so J&J's results are coming out strong, and I'll tell you a bit. The Russians use 2 adenoviruses, 5 and 26, and there's a controversy about their data. Sinovac, Sinopharm, there are 3 vaccines in this, all are attenuated SARS-CoV, which is a completely different platform, and Moderna and Pfizer are using mRNA. So this is the 9 that you see, okay? Let's look at what this phase 2 data issues were. Phase 2 really, there was inadequate numbers on over 55, except for Pfizer and CanSino Bio. Children were not immunized, pregnant women and immunocompromised. The question is, in phase 3, are they going to cover these? I think they'll cover over 65. Question is pregnant women and immunocompromised. That's not known. Oxford, as you know, was on a clinical hold because of questionable transverse myelitis. They've come back, not in all countries. I think India is just about looking at restarting. Here are the results to remember. All vaccines showed anti-coronavirus IgG antibody titers with neutralization equivalent to convalescent plasma. This is the benchmark that's used. Convalescent plasma, benchmark. T-cell activation also occurred. This is very important. And interferon gamma production occurred, but weaker. Older people had weaker responses. This is a big issue. Adenovirus vectors, human ones, face pre-existing immunity. And you are seeing this and CanSino in their Lancet paper said it, that we are actually facing this problem because many people really don't get the response they need. Now there's a problem here, which I'll explain in a second. And the Russian vaccine, there is actually an open paper published by multiple scientists saying that there are a lot of data inconsistencies. They pointed it out. And this is interesting to see how this is going to play out. Distribution, the whole issue of equity is coming up. Why? Countries have pre-bought vaccines. The second issue of equity is a lot of these adenoviral vaccines in many of the low and middle income countries, people already have immunity against it. It's not true in many of the OECD countries. The numbers are quite different. So you find 80% immunity present against adenovirus in, let's say, sub-Saharan African countries, and suddenly in European countries, only 20 to 30%. This is going to blunt the effect of these adenoviral vector vaccines, okay? The other thing to remember is all vaccines need 2 doses, excepting the J&J Beth Israel vaccine, which is the adenovirus 26 vaccine. This is a big deal because if you need 2 doses, you actually have to double the production of 7 billion vaccine if you're going to immunize the whole world. And all RNA vaccines require -80, which is a very, very hard cold chain logistics to manage, okay? 24 hours, within 24 hours of use, of thawing, it has to be used. And that really So when you look at this, this is a mixed bag of data, right? You have to get production up. You have to make sure efficacy is there. You have to make sure you don't have, what's antigen accentuation, which is a big problem, especially when vaccines are, in the coronavirus family, which could be deadly if you have it. So all these things have to be worked through, and not every vaccine is, there are a lot of, if you go under the cover, there are a lot of things to see in terms of human adenoviral and its efficacy at scale. And are we going to cover these cohort of patients that are uncovered? I'm not going to go through detail. I just wanted to show you some actual data. This is the Pfizer and BioNTech, the very new paper. On the right, you see actually matched to convalescent sera, and you're seeing different age groups that they did. They did 2 vaccine variants. One was the receptor binding domain, that was B1. B2 was the full spike. Full spike is showing much stronger results, much lower side reactions, and strong response when benchmarked against convalescent serum. This is a neutralization titer. And this is the Oxford one. I showed it because it's going to be used in India. Again, strong responses. Their control was really a meningitis vaccine, which is the one in green out here. And they all showed responses over days, two shots needed, right? And again, these are different this is different assays that they ran. And in each of the assays, they showed strong responses. So we'll have to see whether, the side reaction that Oxford saw gets played out. Just want to talk of innate immunity, because we tend to forget that we have a whole cell-based immunity. And what's interesting is 40 to 50% of people who don't have coronavirus have immunity against it because they probably got exposed to the cold coronavirus. And 2 cell clusters, CD4 and CD8, are showing immune response. If you see the lower slide, unexposed people, 50% of those of the CD4 population, 20% of CD8 is showing a response. And these are against different parts of the virus. That's why I went through it. The spike, the non-structural protein, and the membranes. And those who are infected, 100% are showing against the spike, the membrane, the inner nucleocapsid, and the non-structural proteins, right? And this is, again, immunoglobulin attachments, IgG 100%, and IgA, interestingly enough, which nobody talks much about, 80% showing against the spike. So what it may suggest is that so many people who have been exposed to the cold coronavirus and those who had SARS will actually have immunity. And so what we are computing in herd immunity is not just seroprevalence, but we have to factor in cell-based immunity. And as you probably know, memory cells for the T cell population, they last many years. And so this is actually a good piece of information that we may actually find inherent immunity in large percentages of the population because of the T cells. I have to talk of BCG. And the BCG study, which is started which has been launched in the Netherlands, is because of this data that came out of the National Academy of Sciences. If you look at BCG inoculated patients versus not, countries that have strong BCG, there's a big difference in mortality. Look at this one. Deaths per million, all BCG countries, 100% BCG requirement, no BCG requirement, mortality difference. Look at this slide, lower right. Countries with no BCG, countries with BCG. Again, interesting Greek study, 3 years of giving BCG in older people, right? They had patients who were over 65. And what did they find? Reduced viral infections. All respiratory infections were reduced. Look at the difference, placebo and BCG. This is the patient cohort, 78 placebo, 72 with BCG. Epigenetic hyperactivation, that genes are primed, increased tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 10, and not much systemic inflammation. So there is a strong circumstantial evidence for BCG that may explain what we are seeing in India. So last slide, and I want to end with this. This is the current India data as of last night. Well, this morning, I did it at 1 o'clock in the morning. So here's the data. This is India with respect to other countries. For the first time, I've seen our numbers have dropped. Look at the lower left graph here. This is the first drop I've seen, but look what's happening to the other countries. Every other country is spiking up. This is wave 2 happening. Just 2 weeks ago, these numbers were flat or down. So you see, if you see Spain, if you see France, everything is up now. My question is India going to, this is lagging. India is lagged behind the initial spike. And is this a lag, or are we going to have strong measures to push this down further? And I think this is the right bend of curve we see. That's the lower left-hand side with the arrow. We need to make sure we don't get into this up spike that all the other countries are seeing. So UK is looking at pre-lockdown measures. Spain is looking at, France is looking at, the US is seeing a spike. Our own state of Massachusetts has seen a spike. Good news is, look at India's case fatality ratio right at the bottom, and look at India's deaths per 100,000 right at the bottom. I think this is a consequence of everything I talked about: T cells, BCG, younger population, maybe stronger innate immunity, and maybe this whole issue of microRNA and its impact on how the virus is being tackled. So here we are, and I want to end with this sobering note. The world is facing 32.5 million cases as of last night, proved cases, around 1 million deaths. The real death numbers and the case numbers are a factor of 10 or 20 more. That's just the estimate that I'm seeing from what everybody's saying, unreported deaths. So it varies a lot, but clearly it's much higher than what the reported numbers are. And this is India's statistic: 5.8 million cases and 92,000 deaths. A lot of unreported deaths, a lot of deaths due to cardiac arrest that were COVID related. So we have still, I think, some ways to go. I think monoclonals are really the best way to, we hope, in terms of intervention, unless we have a breakthrough drug. And then vaccines, as I showed you, it's not going to be one vaccine, it's going to be many vaccines. And one big issue of vaccines is, where are these clinical trials being done? Every platform is different. Every platform has its pluses and minuses. Some data for some platforms have been questioned. And I think we'll have to wait and see how that occurs. So till that happens, the strongest suit we have in our hands is public health measures. Wear your masks, wear them correctly, socially distance when possible. It's an airborne infection. Wash your hands and make sure that these principles are not violated. Then we can continue to see this curve drop. So I tried to compress a lot, but I hope this was helpful. Thanks, Raja.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mehul, for the wonderful presentation. It didn't look like an ophthalmologist was talking, and you made it so simple. I think having the background also of an ophthalmologist you made it so simple for us to understand. So we feel now like we know a lot about COVID, but I'm sure many people have questions. But I have one question on the learnings from this pandemic, whether, if health ministries and departments and WHO were to face another similar pandemic, what would they do differently? I mean, there are many things we could have retrospectively, we can always second guess, but
Yeah.
I feel that some of the decisions were slow off the blocks. Like even trials, negative trials, fortunately, there were no good effective drugs we have found so far. I'm saying fortunately because there was an initial gap, delay in starting these multi-center trials. And if it had worked, then we would have had so many avoidable deaths initially. So what are your thoughts on what could be the learnings from this?
Yeah, so I think, Raja, that's a very fundamental question every country is asking. And let's look at so I think the best way to look at it is which countries have done it really well. South Korea. Now, what did South Korea do? They set a whole national pandemic response plan. And in fact, in December last year or late last year, they ran a simulation on a novel coronavirus. Can you believe it? And they had the technology people, they had the first responders and the public health side all ready. So this is really a system-based approach that countries need to adopt. How are we going to respond? How is surveillance going to occur? How is technology going to really respond to a rapidly spreading pathogen in terms of contact tracing, in terms of identifying people, in terms of locking them down, and how is science in parallel going to uncover what is the biology of this pathogen? And can we have ready, available therapeutic platforms that could be deployed fast so that they can then attack? You see, we lost a lot of time because after MERS, we stopped the development process of so many of the vaccines. We said, oh, MERS only ended with, few patients, couple of tens of thousands of patients. So we don't need to develop. And I think for the billions of dollars that were saved there, trillions are being lost now. So it's really a combination of many things. Public health and health systems have to work together. Surveillance has to be stronger. Has to be a national mandate to rapidly deploy science and rapidly deploy treatment and therapeutics. And then you have to have a national system in place to respond. In the absence of that, you can't.
Thanks, Mel. We probably have time for just one more question, which we have from Dr. Swati Singh. Can reinfection present as an altered immune response? In the sense, can the second infection be different from the first infection response? And do asymptomatic patients, can they have organ damage post-recovery?
I think both very good questions. So let me try and address that. First of all, let's answer the question, is reinfection possible? And now we know it is. Because a primary infection, if it's not strong or it's not a bad infection, will not create a sustained immune response. So we do know, and how do we know that there are proved reinfections and this is not lingering COVID? Is because the genomic sequence of the second infection was different than the first infection of the virus. That's how we know. So to your question is the second infection stronger than the first? No, because it's unlikely to be, because there is already some memory of the first infection that will stimulate a stronger and faster response in the second. So in the 9 proved cases of second infections that I have seen so far, and there may be more because my data is a week old, and funny, in this whole COVID pandemic, a week old is old data now. It's that the second infection were all milder. They're all milder. This is genomically proved, 2 different viral strains. That's number 1. Asymptomatic cases or mildly symptomatic cases and long-term damage or long-term issues, we have to figure this one out. Because in the study that came out of Germany, the Frankfurt University study, there were mild cases that got treated at home, and yet 78% of that cohort had some cardiac involvement. Even in the study that the NCAA released in the US with athletes, COVID positive cases, asymptomatic, had shown some amount of cardiac changes. So I think what we are going to see is still to play out, but it seems likely this pandemic will have a tail. We do know it's going to have a tail on one thing, which I didn't talk about, which is much bigger, is mental health. Mental health is going to is already being seen. Depression is up, anxiety is up, suicide numbers are up, alcoholism up, drug use is up. And this is even worse in the adolescent population.
Yeah, so I think on a sober note, we will have to end here. But I think the best thing we can do is what you mentioned about social distancing, wearing face mask whenever we move out. So physical preventive measures are still the best way to tackle this pandemic at this point of time. But thank you so much, Mehul, for this wonderful presentation. You made it so simple, eloquent, and I must congratulate you on this presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you all for those who have attended this meeting. Have a wonderful
Thank you for having me.
Weekend.
Thank you, Dr. Mehul. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnaz. Bye-bye. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Be safe, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.